Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Unbound Verse. And tonight we're discussing a very current topic that seems to be never ending in Africa. It's titled Protests in Africa. Protests in Africa. Protests in Africa are often driven by a combination of socio-political, economic, and environmental factors. Here are some practical reasons specific to the African context why there are protests in Africa. Economic hardship is the first one. High unemployment rates, poverty, inflation, and economic mismanagement are major drivers of protests in Africa. People often protest against the rising cost of living, lack of job opportunities, and inadequate social services. Corruption and poor governance is another one. Widespread corruption, lack of transparency, and government inefficiency are common causes of protest. Citizens demand accountability from their leaders, better public services, and an end to corrupt practices. Political repression and lack of democracy is another reason. In many African countries, protests arise from demands for greater political freedom, fair elections, and an end to authoritarian rule. When governments suppress oppositions, limit free speech, or manipulate electoral processes, people often take to the street. Human rights violation is another reason. Protests often occur in response to human rights abuses, including police brutality, arbitrary arrest, and violations of freedom of expression. Movements like EndSARS in Nigeria, #EndSARS in Nigeria exemplify protests against systemic abuse by state security forces. Ethnic and sectarian tensions. Africa's diverse ethnic landscape sometimes leads to protests when certain groups feel marginalized or discriminated against by the government or other dominant groups. These protests can also be sparked by land disputes and resource allocation issues. Environmental issues and land rights is another reason protests break out in Africa often. Protests often arise over environmental degradation, land grabbing, and the exploitation of natural resources by both local elites and foreign companies. Communities protest against the destruction of their environment and the loss of land that is vital for their livelihoods. Education and social services is another reason. Protests are common among students and young people demanding better access to education, improvement in the quality of education, and greater investment in social services like healthcare and housing. Social justice and inequality. Protests are sometimes motivated by demands for social justice, including gender equality, the rights of marginalized communities, and the fight against systemic inequality. Influx of global movements is another reason protests break out in Africa. Global movements and trends, such as those advocating for democracy, climate action, or anti corruption, often influence protests in Africa, especially among the youth who are increasingly connected to global issues through social media. These factors often intersect, leading to widespread discontent and mobilization across the continent. Discontent and mobilization across the continent. The underlying issues vary by country and region, but they are often connected to broader themes of governance, equity, and access to resources. Now, let's explain each point with deeper and much more details. And here are more detailed explanation of each point that I just mentioned ahead that are related to protests in Africa. Economic hardship. Africa faces significant economic challenges, including high unemployment rates, widespread poverty, and inflation. In many countries, the majority of the population struggles to meet basic needs due to low wages and limited job opportunities. The economic hardship is exacerbated by weak infrastructure, inadequate access to education, and a lack of social safety nets. As a result, protests often erupt as citizens demand better economic conditions, job creation, and more equitable distribution of resources. Moreover, many African countries are heavily reliant on external debt and foreign aid, which can lead to austerity measures that further strain the economy. When governments impose taxes or cut subsidies on essential goods like fuel, food, healthcare, it can spark mass protests. These protests are not only about immediate economic relief, but also about demanding long-term economic reforms that can create sustainable growth and reduce inequality. Corruption and poor governance. Corruption is a pervasive issue in many African countries, where public officials often misuse their power for personal gain. This has led to widespread dissatisfaction with governments that are seen as being more interested in enriching themselves than serving the public. Protests often arise as citizens demand greater transparency, accountability, and end to corruption practices. They call for reforms that can ensure that public resources are used to improve infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other essential services. Poor governance also manifests in the form of inefficient public services, lack of infrastructure, and the mismanagement of resources. This has a direct impact on the daily lives of citizens who may experience frequent power outages, poor transportation, and inadequate healthcare. The frustration with these issues often culminates in protests as people demand a more effective and responsive government that can meet their need and improve their quality of life. Political repression and lack of democracy. In several African countries, political repression is a significant issue with governments cracking down on opposition parties, activists, and journalists. This stifles political dissent and limits citizens' ability to participate in the democratic process. Protests often emerge in response to these restrictions, with people demanding free and fair elections, greater political freedom, and protection of civil liberties. These movements are often led by young people and civil society organizations who are pushing for democratic reforms and more inclusive governance. Lack of democracy also fuels protests when governments manipulate electoral processes, such as by rigging elections or extending their time in power through constitutional changes. Citizens often feel disenfranchised and see protests as one of the few ways to express their discontent and demand political change. These protests can lead to significant political upheaval and in some cases, even regime change. Human rights violations. Human rights violations, including police brutality, arbitrary arrest, and restrictions on freedom of expression, are common triggers for protests in Africa. In many cases, security forces are used to suppress dissent, leading to violence and further unrest. Movements like EndSARS in Nigeria, which protested against police brutality, have highlighted the widespread abuse of power by state security agencies. Such protests often call for justice for victims, accountability for perpetrators, and comprehensive reforms of security institutions. Beyond police brutality, protests may also arise in response to broader human rights issues, such as discrimination against marginalized groups, gender-based violence, or the suppression of press freedom. Human rights organizations and activists often play a crucial role in mobilizing citizens and raising awareness about these issues, leading to large-scale protests that demand respect for human rights and the rule of law. Ethnic and sectarian tensions. Africa's diverse ethnic and religious landscape can sometimes lead to tension and conflicts, especially when certain groups feel marginalized or discriminated against. These tensions can be exacerbated by competition over resource, land, and political power. Protests often arise when ethnic or sectarian groups demand greater autonomy, recognition of their rights, or a more equitable distribution of resources. These protests can escalate into violent conflicts if not addressed, leading to further instability and displacement of communities. In some cases, governments may be perceived as favoring certain ethnic or religious groups, leading to accusations of bias and unfair treatment. This can fuel protests as marginalized groups seek to assert their rights and challenge the status quo. Addressing these tensions requires not only immediate conflict resolution efforts but also long-term strategies to promote inclusivity, social cohesion, and equitable development across all countries. Environmental issues and land rights. Environmental degradation, land grabbing, and exploitation of natural resources are significant issues in many African countries. Communities that depend on the land for their livelihood often find themselves displaced or facing environmental destruction due to mining, logging, or large-scale agricultural projects. Protests arise when local populations demand the protection of their land rights, environmental preservation, and compensation for the loss of their homes or livelihoods. These protests can sometimes be met with violent repression, particularly when powerful interests are involved. In addition to land rights, environmental issues such as pollution, deforestation, and climate change are becoming increasingly prominent trigger for protests. Activists and local communities often mobilize to demand action on climate change, stricter environmental regulations, and the protection of natural resources. These protests reflect a growing awareness of the need for sustainable development that balances economic growth with environmental conservation. Education and social services. Access to quality education and adequate social services remains a challenge in many African countries. Protests often emerge when students and educators demand better funding for education, improved school facilities, and more equitable access to educational opportunities. In some cases, protests may also arise in response to government policies that are perceived as undermining the quality of education, such as cuts to education budgets or the imposition of fees that makes education unaffordable for many. Beyond education, protests can also be driven by demands for better healthcare, housing, and other social services. Inadequate public services are a source of frustration for many citizens who often have to contend with poor infrastructure, lack of access to clean water, and overcrowded healthcare facilities. Protests in this context often call for increased government investment in social services and more equitable distribution of resources to ensure that all citizens have access to basic needs. Social justice and inequality. Social justice issues, including gender inequality, discrimination, and systemic inequality, are also key drivers of protests in Africa. Movements advocating for gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and the rights of marginalized communities have gained momentum in recent years. These movements often challenge deeply entrenched social norms and push for legal and policy reforms that promote equality and social justice. Protests in this context can be sparked by incidents of discrimination or violence against marginalized groups, as well as by broader systemic issues that perpetuate inequality. Inequality in access to resources and opportunity is another significant issue that drives protests. Many African countries have stark disparities between rich and poor, urban and rural areas, and different ethnic or religious groups. Protests often arise when this inequality becomes too pronounced and citizens demand a more equitable distribution of wealth, resources, and opportunities. Addressing these issues require not only immediate policy changes but also long-term efforts to tackle the root causes of inequality. Influx of global movement. The global interconnectedness brought about by the internet and social media has had a significant impact on protests in Africa. Movements that begin in one part of the world can quickly inspire similar actions across the continent. For example, the global Black Lives Matter movement has resonated with many Africans, leading to protests against racial discrimination and police brutality in their own countries. Similarly, global climate strikes and environmental activism have inspired protests across Africa, particularly among the youth who are increasingly aware of global environmental issues. These global movements often provide a framework for local protest, with activists adapting the strategies and messaging of global campaigns to their specific national or regional context. This cross-pollination of ideas and tactics has helped to energize protest movements in Africa, making them more organized and impactful. The influx of global movement also highlights the interconnectedness of struggles for justice, democracy, and human rights across the world. Now, what are the major practical ways to not have all these protests sprouting up all around Africa? Addressing the root causes of protests in Africa requires a multifaceted approach that involves both immediate interventions and long-term strategies. Here are some major practical ways to reduce the likelihood of protests in Africa. Economic reforms and poverty alleviation. To reduce economic hardship, governments need to implement policies that promote sustainable economic growth and job creation. Investing in infrastructure, education, and technology can create new opportunities and boost productivity. Additionally, promoting small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and improving access to credit for entrepreneurs can stimulate economic activity and reduce unemployment. Targeted social welfare programs can help alleviate poverty by providing direct support to the most vulnerable populations, such as cash transfers, food assistance, and affordable healthcare. Government should also focus on reducing income inequality by implementing progressive tax policies and ensuring that wealth and resources are more equitably distributed. Strengthening social safety nets such as unemployment benefits and pensions can provide a buffer for those affected by economic downturns. In the long term, promoting industrialization, diversification of the economy, and regional trade can reduce dependence on external aid and create a more resilient economic foundation. Combating corruption and improving governance. Combating corruption and improving governance. Tackling corruption is essential to improving governance and restoring public trust in government institutions. Government should establish independent anti-corruption bodies with the power to investigate and prosecute corruption cases at all levels of government. Ensuring transparency in public spending, such as through open budgeting process and public procurement reforms, can reduce opportunities for corruptions. Whistleblower protections and freedom of information laws can also empower citizens and civil society organizations to hold officials accountable. Improving governance also requires enhancing the capacity of public institutions to deliver services effectively. This can be achieved by investing in public sector training, modernizing administrative processes, and ensuring merit-based appointments in public offices. Encouraging citizen participation in decision-making through mechanisms like participatory budgeting and community consultations can help align government policies with the needs and priorities of the population. Strengthening democratic institutions and political freedoms. To address political repression and strengthen democracy, government must ensure that democratic institutions such as the judiciary, electoral commissions, and parliament are independent and free from political interference. Holding free and fair elections with transparent processes and oversight by independent observers is crucial for maintaining political stability and public trust in the democratic process. Government should also respect the rights of opposition parties and civil society organizations to operate freely and participate in the political process. Protecting political freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of press is essential for a healthy democracy. Government should repeal laws that restrict this freedom and ensure that security forces respect the rights of citizens to protest peacefully. Dialogue and negotiation should be prioritized over oppression when addressing dissent, as this can help resolve conflicts before they escalate into widespread protest. Protecting human rights and strengthening rule of law. Protecting human rights and strengthening rule of law. To prevent human rights violations, government should prioritize comprehensive reforms of security institutions to ensure they operate within the law and they respect human rights. This includes training security forces on human rights standards, improving oversight mechanisms, and ensuring accountability for abuses. Establishing independent human rights commissions with the authority to investigate violations and provide redress to victims can also help build public trust in the rule of law. Strengthening the judiciary and ensuring that it operates independently and impartially is essential for upholding human rights and the rule of law. Governments should also ratify and implement international human rights treaties and integrate them into national legislation. Providing human rights education and raising awareness amongst the population can empower citizens to know and assert their rights, reducing the likelihood of violation and subsequent protest. Promoting social cohesion and addressing ethnic tension. Promoting social cohesion and addressing ethnic tensions. To reduce ethnic and sectarian tensions, government should promote inclusive governance that represents all ethnic and religious groups fairly. This can be achieved through policies that ensure equitable distribution of resources, power sharing arrangements, and affirmative action where necessary. Promoting inter-ethnic dialogue and reconciliation efforts can help build trust and understanding between different communities, reducing the risk of conflict. Addressing underlying issues such as land disputes and resource allocation is also critical. Government should implement land reform policies that ensure fair access to land and protect the rights of indigenous and marginalized communities. Establishing mechanisms for resolving land disputes peacefully, such as through mediation or arbitration, can prevent conflict from escalating into violent protest. Environmental sustainability and protection of land rights. Environmental sustainability and protection of land rights. To address environmental issues and protect land rights, government should enforce strict environmental regulations that prevent land degradation, deforestation, and pollution. This includes regulating industries such as mining, logging, and agriculture to ensure they operate sustainably and with minimal environmental impact. Government should also promote sustainable land use practices and provide support to communities for conservation efforts. Protecting land rights, particularly for indigenous and rural communities, is essential for preventing land-related conflicts. Government should recognize and formalize customary land rights and provide legal protection against land grabbing. In cases where land must be acquired for development projects, government should ensure that affected communities are adequately compensated and involved in decision-making processes. Providing alternative livelihood and resettlement options can also help mitigate the impact of land dispossession. Investing in education and social services. Investing in education and social services. Improving access to quality education and social services can reduce the likelihood of protests related to these issues. Government should increase funding for education and healthcare, ensuring that all citizens have access to affordable and high-quality services. These include building and maintaining schools, building and maintaining hospitals and other public infrastructure, as well as training and retaining skilled teachers, doctors, and other public servants. Promoting equitable access to education and social services is also important. This can be achieved through policies that target disadvantaged groups, such as scholarships for low-income students or free healthcare for rural communities. Ensuring that public services are delivered efficiently and without corruption can build public confidence in the government and reduce grievances that lead to protests. Promoting social justice and reducing inequality. Promoting social justice and reducing inequality. To promote social justice and reduce inequality, government should implement policies that address the root causes of inequality, such as unequal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. This includes affirmative action policies that ensure marginalized groups have equal access to resources and opportunities. Governments should also work to eliminate discriminatory laws and practices that perpetuate inequality, such as those related to gender, ethnicity, or religion. Promoting social justice also requires creating an inclusive society where all citizens feel valued and respected. This can be achieved through public awareness campaigns, education, and community programs that promote tolerance, diversity, and respect for human rights. Governments should also support civil society organizations that work to promote social justice and provide a platform for marginalized voices to be heard. Engaging with global movements and addressing global issues. Engaging with global movements and addressing global issues. To address the influence of global movements and prevent protests related to global issues, African governments should engage proactively with these movements and address the underlying concerns they raise. For example, in response to global climate activism, governments should commit to environmental sustainability and participate in international efforts to combat climate change. By taking meaningful action on global issues, government can demonstrate their commitment to addressing the concerns of their citizens and reduce the likelihood of protests. Engaging with global movement also requires being responsive to the demands of the population, particularly the youth, who are often the most connected to global trends. Governments should create platforms for dialogue with young people and other groups that are actively involved in global movements. By involving these groups in policy making and addressing their concerns, governments can build trust and reduce the likelihood of protests driven by global issues. I do have a hopeful conclusion for everybody that's listening to this video. Creating a more stable and peaceful Africa is not just a distant dream, but an achievable reality through thoughtful and strategic actions. By addressing the root causes of protests, whether they stem from economic hardship, corruption, political repression, or social inequality, African nations can pave the way for sustainable development and social harmony. Governments that prioritize inclusive governance, protect human rights, and invest in their people's well-being will foster environments where protests become less necessary as citizens feel heard, respected, and hopeful about their future. To path to The path to reducing protests in Africa is fundamentally about building trust between government and their citizens. When leaders listen, engage, and act in the best interests of their people, they create a foundation for lasting peace and prosperity. With a collective commitment to justice, equity, and development, Africa can overcome its challenges and emerge stronger, with its diverse cultures and communities united in a shared vision of progress and hope. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.